Morning all. I'd like to continue tracking the evolution of Bobby Fischer and look at Curaçao again, another key game. The very first game that Fischer played when he stepped off the plane, he was slightly late for the opening ceremony and arrived on the morning of this game against Pal Benko, who was from the United States. Now Fischer, prior to this tournament, this Curaçao tournament, had done very well in the Bled tournament of 1961. He had actually beaten Tao in that game. That was Tao's only loss in Bled 1961, the Alakai Memorial, played September 3rd to October 3rd. And Fischer had not had a single loss in that tournament, so he came second with 13.5. Tao had 14.5. Then, in the interzonal, which was a qualifier for this Curaçao tournament, the interzonal tournament was played in Stockholm, and in this Fischer completely, dominated. He scored 17.5 points in the interzonal in Stockholm. The 23-player single round robin was won convincingly by the 18-year-old Bobby Fischer with 17.5 out of 22, 13 wins, 9 draws, no losses, margin of 2.5 points. And, he came above Geller, FM Geller on 15, Tigran Petrosian on 15, Korchnoi on 14. He came ahead of Pal Benko, who was in joint position with Gligoric and Stein. Now, Stein actually won the tie-break, and in theory was going to join the other USSR players, but there was a rule which meant that actually you couldn't have more than 3 players from the same country. So instead of Stein, Pal Benko was a bit lucky there with that rule, so he was chosen instead for this candidates tournament. So playing against Fischer, he ventures with a very interesting first move. Very interesting indeed. He plays the move G3, and you might think, well, isn't this like a King's Indian attack type thing? If White wants to play Knight F3, Bishop G2, later D3, that's what we could call a King's Indian attack. The King's Indian defense in reverse with an extra move. But actually, hold on a sec, this knight does not need to go to F3. This is a viable system in its own right, and it's got other names. It's actually quite a popular first move. Its other names, well, it became known because of Benko's use in this particular tournament. It became known partly as the Benko's Opening, but it's also known as the Hungarian Opening, the Barksa Opening, the Bilek Opening, and the King's Fianchetto Opening. So G3. Okay, and Benko was later to use it against Tao in a later round and did well there. But let's have a look at this game. So, just a recap on Pal Benko. So Pal Benko, a chess grandmaster, author and composer of endgame studies and chess problems. Born in Amiens, France, but raised in Hungary. He was Hungarian champion by the age of 20. He emigrated to the United States in 1958 after defecting following the World Student Team Championship in Reykjavik, Iceland, 1957. FIDE awarded him the Grandmaster title in 1958. His highest achievement was qualifying and competing in the Candidates tournaments, the tournament to decide the challenger for the World Championship in 1959 and 62. Okay, a bit fortunate, as was just mentioned, on qualifier he overtook Stein because of the rule. But anyway, both tournaments had 8 of the world's top players. He finished 8th in 1959 and 6th in 1962, and he also qualified for the 1970 interzonal tournament. But he gave up his spot in that for Bobby Fischer, who went on, as we know, to win the World Championship in 1972. So, okay, so what happened in this game? G3, Benko's Opening, Knight F6. Black is not committing to D5, and I suspect it's because of this that White's not necessarily keen on playing Knight F3 here. He waits a bit. Bishop G2 doesn't block in the scope of this bishop. G6. And here, now, he makes d5 a little bit uncomfortable. If black did want to try to play d5, it's made a little bit uncomfortable now. The bishop does support an immediate e4 here. So d5, maybe we can just take here and extend the scope of the bishop. Maybe it's discouraging that. Fischer's move is d6. And now we see classical two pawns in the centre, controlling the centre like this, with this knight refusing to commit. It doesn't want to now anyway, because the knight's on e4. The knight has this other idea that it can go to e2 here. And this is a very interesting setup. In fact, some sources say, instead of Benko's opening, like Benko's attack system of attack. Let's have a look. Bishop g7, knight e2. So why would this be interesting? Well, maybe, I'm just going to add engine bits here. I just want to check something. Bishop g4, the viability of f3. Actually, no, bishop g4, e5. Okay, so this bishop is potentially quite dangerous on this diagonal. And this would be a bit better for white, even if the queens come off here. This is big trouble for black. Okay, so this bishop can't be underestimated. This e5 break is quite dangerous. So casual move like bishop g4 can't exploit this system. So black actually castled here. And now white castles and e5 is played. So it looks like a fairly comfortable position for white, and he's avoided a lot of opening theory indeed. Knight bc3, c6, and now with c6, statistically a lot of games are lost for this pawn on d6, which can become a total lemon, and black players think that they're going to get enough play if they do ed later on the e file. Sometimes this really doesn't work out. So will this game be a disaster for d6, or will d6 turn into d5 later? Let's see. So a4, knight bd7, and now this clamping down with a5 as well, trying to discourage black from b5s. A bit uncomfortable for black. And now Fischer does commit to e takes d4. Now with Fischer's judgment, you know, he's done very well in two tournaments, Bled and Stockholm, so he's judging this d6 pawn here to be perfectly viable. But let's see, knight takes d4 as part of trying to prove d6 is actually an exploitable weakness. What white has to do, and I know this from bitter experience, having been crushed in a season just gone, the back side of something similar with d6. What white has to do is remove black's perk in this position, which is the pressure that black can potentially exert on e4. Once white can do that, he can get to work on building pressure on d6. And black's game, this might be the real fatal flaw of black's position here structurally. If you look at the structure, this is really a potentially, we call it a potentially exploitable weakness here. But first, you know, white has to deal with black's pressure on the e4 pawn. So we see knight c5. And now indeed bishop g4 might be a nuisance move, as well as maybe knight g4s. And rook e8 to come. So what does white want to do? Well, he plays actually h3 first. Rook e8, and now he just protects that. So at the moment e4 secure. d5 looks as though it's locked down enough from black to try and resolve this. Is not an option. So knight f d7 is played, and now we see bishop e3, queen c7, and now white takes away the e5 square from black with f4. We see rook b8, and an echo of d6 being a problem here, queen d2. If white can potentially build pressure, but what about his a pawn? He needs to sort that out surely as well. If he's going to move this rook, he can't lose the a pawn. So d6 remains a prospect here of an exploitable weakness. And Fischer lashes out now with the move b5. White takes on b6, a takes, And there's a slight problem with a forcing move with some strategic consequence here in this particular position. The forcing move, which is played by Pal Benko, is b4, and the strategic consequence for black in this particular position is that we haven't heard the last of this bishop on this diagonal. In particular, c6 is a bit vulnerable, and in particular with b4, now there's a powerful undermining move available, which white plays, positionally undermining a bit black's light square control here. So for the moment the key issue isn't trying to win d6, but there's another problem with black now which has emerged. White plays b5, trying to soften black up on the dark squares to encourage c5 to weaken d5. Okay, now if c5 here, then the knight might find a home on c6, and this is very, very unpleasant indeed. So Fischer takes on d4, and he slightly weakens his king here by losing that fianchetto bishop. Queen takes d4, and there's a problem. Okay, if he plays c takes, this doesn't look too appetizing. Knight takes. If queen takes here, knight takes d6, and this is a monster knight, and black's going to end up getting destroyed here with this sort of pressure on c8. So okay, so basically black doesn't want to play that. He wants to play the lesser evil move c5. He's giving up d5. He's still got that backward pawn. We see queen d2. So white's not just got this fixed target now. He's removed a lot of black's theoretical counterplay on e4, and he now has to factor in knight d5. So bishop b7 ticks a few boxes here, put a bit of pressure on e4, give the option of taking on d5. But now the pawn is picked on, finally, rook ad1. So what can black do about this pawn? Well, it seems that the pawn can be protected with rook e6, which is what is played. But unfortunately now, e5, using the pin on the knight. Is this really going to spell doom? Have I been over-exaggerating the fatal flaw in black's position? Which is easy to do if you know the outcome of the game in advance as an annotator. Well, yes, I guess I've been exaggerating the importance of this, but I think statistically a lot of players are losing with black with this dreaded backward d pawn. Okay, so e5 here, he's giving away his pride bishop here. Bishop takes g2, king takes g2, because he's set his sights on this d6. Check. And curiously, white doesn't play king h2, but rather king f2, and the engines actually give king f2 a slightly more accurate. So king f2 is played here, which might be quite difficult to fathom, but both are good for white. But king f2 apparently slightly better. So what is black doing about d6? Well, maybe it's not that difficult to fathom that for you if you think that the king's actually protecting e1. If we had, let's try and prove this. If king h2, we can perhaps use the counterpin rook e8 or not. Not really, knight e4, and this is quite unpleasant for knight d6. So white would still be better there, but there is in theory some extra security on e1, and this diagonal isn't a problem for the white king. So he's adding some support for the e1 rook. Okay, so we see rook d8, and now this pawn is taken here. Knight e4 is also another interesting move, but e takes d6. So does this really spell the end of the game just because black had that backward d pawn? You know, Fischer, just to remind you, he hadn't lost in Bled or the interzonal. Is he really going to lose because of this backward pawn issue on d6 just because he's lost the pawn here? Can he drum something up? He plays knight f6. We see rook takes e6, f takes e6, and now move queen e3, attacking e6. The king comes to defend e6, and then he offers a queen exchange. And you know, white can, after the queen exchange, always play knight e4 to hold this pawn, and the knight's dislodgeable. For example, you know, queen takes. I mean, it's looking fairly hopeless here because of knight e4. So he doesn't really want queen exchange. Fischer plays queen b8. And now a cunning move, knight e4, which seems to almost blunder the pawn, you might think, because after knight takes, queen takes, you might think rook takes d6. I think rook takes d6 doesn't work though. I think there's a crushing move here if this was played. Simple and crushing. I wonder if you can spot it if I give you 10 seconds. Okay, queen e5 would just exploit this pin here. The queen supported by the pawn. There's no clever check or anything. It's just winning material here. And if rook d8 as a resource, we have the more subtle resource here for white. Can you spot it if this had been a game continuation? If I give you 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, rook d7 check. So if rook takes, we take the queen. If king e8, we just play queen e6 mating. So that's pretty dire. If king f8, queen h8, otherwise we're mating black. So this is why this pawn cannot be recaptured. Queen e5 is very powerful here. So black plays rook d7, and it's getting really miserable after queen c6. This is not what Fischer had hoped for his first round in this tournament. This sort of position. Queen d8, and now king f3, as though the king's preparing itself for the endgame a bit more. King g7, and then we see the move g4. So what's white's plan? Is he really just going to get this grip on the dark squares? Is his threat g5? Well, he can build up things slowly. He can play king g3 to extinguish queen h4. Fischer gets a bit desperate here. He plays e5 to try and drum something up against white's king. It's taken, calling Fischer's bluff. Check. King g2, and we have this apparent attack with queen and rook on f2. And white has, though, these connected central pass pawns. So he doesn't mind losing the h3 pawn to get rid of a pair of rooks with rook f1. There's nothing much Fischer can do here. He takes on f1, he takes his h3 pawn, and he's not going to be winning g4 here. In fact, this is a very accurate move now. Queen g2 is played. If white did play king f2, then there's lots of checks actually. Well, here actually now not check, but queen takes g4, and then there'll be lots of checks. If d7, I think black's actually technically able to draw this with all the checks. So this move just extinguishes black's dreams after queen takes h3. Pal Benko played queen g2. Okay, so queen moves to e3, and now queen e2. After check, Fischer actually resigned without waiting for any adjournment of this game. Resigned without resuming play. White can play either queen g2 or king f2. If he plays king f2 here, sorry, black resigned here. So check, check. Say queen d5, queen d3. There's still a few moves to go, but the king could crawl up like this in theory. It's an example. It's going to be slow but sure progress. If this kind of continuation, the king can even crawl into the position. These two connected pass pawns will eventually win. So anyway, Fischer didn't really want to continue much. Okay. So it was Pal Benko. He used this opening with great success here. This g3, and the opening, because of this tournament, started to become known as Pal Benko's opening, the Benko's opening g3. So I believe its unique distinction by not committing a knight to f3 is to play for this setup where if you can ideally get 2 pawns here, you can put the knight on e2. And the d6 backward pawn was a bit of a problem for Mikhail Tal in the later round, actually, as well. So that d6 backward pawn is one of the ways that black's going to end up strategically losing if he's not careful against this setup, if he adopts a King's Indian setup. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.